At one point in human history, a single island's nation managed to conquer, colonize, or coerce its way to controlling a quarter of the entire globe. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the fascinating historical mechanics, and honestly, the perfect storm of events that brought about the collapse of the absolute largest empire the world has ever seen. You know that legendary phrase, the sun never sets on the British Empire? Well, ironically enough, the British actually borrowed it from the Spanish. But under British rule, their naval power was just so incredibly absolute that it practically dictated global time zones. It made this boast a literal reality across the planet. No matter what time it was, daylight was always shining on at least one part of their territory. To put that into perspective, we're talking about a staggering 13 million square miles of territory. That's roughly 400 million people living under the crown at its absolute peak, which was about 1/4 of the world's population at the time. The sheer administrative and logistical nightmare of governing that much of humanity, it's honestly almost impossible for us to comprehend today. So how does an empire that massive just unravel? Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at the empire at its absolute peak, then the crushing cost of global wars, the rise of independence movements, the shift to a new world order, and finally, the empire's enduring legacy. All right, let's jump right into part one, at its absolute peak, the zenith of British power. So even for an uncontested superpower, managing a global footprint of that size is astronomically expensive. And well before the World Wars even kicked off, the structural cracks were already starting to show. Events like the Boer War proved brutally costly. Add to that an escalating, really high-stakes naval arms race with Germany, and the British Treasury was bleeding dry just trying to maintain its basic operational scope. Which brings us to part two, the cost of global wars, and the ultimate financial drain. It turns out military victory came at a catastrophic financial price. During the First World War, Britain deployed millions of soldiers overseas, which left them with crippling debts, even though they were on the winning side. Then, the Second World War hits, bringing completely destroyed cities and deeply weakened industries. To just survive, Britain had to take on a massive financial burden. We're talking about the multi-billion-dollar Anglo-American loan from the United States. Their domestic economy was so completely shattered that basic food rationing actually had to continue all the way until 1954. Wild, right? The sheer bankruptcy following 1945 essentially meant the government simply could not afford to project power anymore. They couldn't send troops across the world to suppress colonial uprisings. The deep debt of the First War bled right into the industrial destruction of the Second. This rapid succession of shocks transformed the loss of colonial control by 1947 from a mere political choice into an absolute economic inevitability. And that leads us perfectly into part three, the rise of independence and the resulting domino effect. The loss of India in 1947 was a monumental, truly seismic shift in world history. Years of highly organized political struggle, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi, completely dismantled foreign control. It ultimately culminated in Lord Mountbatten orchestrating this highly rushed, almost panicked partition in just a matter of months. That alone highlights the absolute speed at which Britain was forced to extract itself from what they called the crown jewel of their empire. That successful push for freedom in India sent an unstoppable wave across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Middle East. The momentum was just entirely undeniable at this point. By 1960, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan actually delivered his famous Winds of Change speech. He officially acknowledged that this rising tide of national consciousness and the sheer demand for self-rule across these continents was something that could simply no longer be fought. Now let's zoom out a bit for part four, a new world order, and the crushing external pressure. After World War II, Britain found itself firmly boxed in by the US and the Soviet Union. Now, these were two new global superpowers with massive ideological differences, but they actually shared a mutual disdain for the old colonial empires. The ultimate nail in the coffin, though, really came during the 1956 Suez Crisis. The Americans and Soviets essentially forced Britain to back down in Egypt, which publicly proved to the whole world that Britain could no longer just act independently as a premier global superpower. There was also this incredibly powerful ideological weapon at play, self-determination, which was heavily promoted by the newly formed UN. Interestingly enough, this seed was planted earlier during the signing of the Atlantic Charter. The US essentially pressured Britain into agreeing to respect the right of all peoples to choose their own government. in exchange for vital World War II support. This clever geopolitical move effectively made the old model of empire fundamentally incompatible with the modern post-war world order. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, the empire's enduring legacy and the echoes of empire. So instead of just evaporating overnight, Britain brilliantly pivoted from sovereign dominance to voluntary cooperation. They developed the Commonwealth. Now you might be wondering, why on earth would newly independent nations willingly join hands with their former rulers? Well, it largely came down to mutual benefit. Economic perks, shared trade networks, and cultural ties, like the Commonwealth Games, offered real pragmatic advantages in a rapidly globalizing world. The physical borders vanished for sure, but fundamental structural systems remained deeply entrenched. I mean, the English language became the global default for business and diplomacy. Even today, countless independent nations still operate on British-influenced common law legal systems. They drive on the left side of the road, and they share this massive global obsession with sports like cricket and rugby. To summarize, the collapse of the largest empire in history wasn't triggered by a single catastrophic event. It was a four-step perfect storm. A deadly combination of empty bank accounts following two massive world wars, internal righteous fury from subjects demanding their freedom, and a geopolitical changing of the guard that permanently stripped Britain of its leverage on the world stage. Since the impact of this incredible historical shift continues to be studied and heavily debated globally, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder about your own surroundings. How much of the world you navigate today was shaped by the rise and the ultimate fall of this massive global structure? Thanks so much for joining this explainer.